Good evening and welcome to the latest in our series of FCC Zoom events. I'm Keith Richburg. I'm the president of the FCC. Before we get to tonight's event, and I should say tonight if you're joining us live, which is Monday, March 28th, because you might be watching this later on YouTube. But coming up on March 31st, which is a Thursday, we're going to do a little special presentation, which I'll again be hosting on the legal access gap in Hong Kong. During this period of the pandemic, there's been more and more need for legal aid, legal assistance from marginalized people in the community here. But it's become more and more difficult, we believe, for people to actually access the available legal services. And our panelists include Kate McArdle, who is the founder and director of Legal Justice Limited, Patricia Ho, who's the founder of Hong Kong Dignity Institute, and also Alan Lau, who's the co-founder and director of Street Law Hong Kong. So that's going to be coming up on Thursday, March 31st, also available on our YouTube channel. But for tonight's event, I'm really excited about this one. It's a book talk, and you know how much we love book talks here in Hong Kong and at the FCC. The book is America Second: How Hong Kong's Elites Are Making China Stronger. A very in-your-face controversial title. And our guest is an old friend of mine, Isaac Stone-Fish, who is the founder and CEO of the research firm Strategy Risks. That's what he says now, but I actually know him as a journalist. He was actually a journalist, a correspondent in Beijing. When I was in Beijing, he was there with Newsweek magazine. He spent more than 7 years in Beijing. He then worked for Foreign Policy magazine, which you might know in the United States. He's a graduate of Columbia University. He's done all kinds of things. He's got so many titles, I can't even name them all. He's a fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's a columnist for Barron's. He's also a columnist for the Washington Post Global Opinion section. Full disclosure, I am as well. So we'll see you on the pages, Isaac. Welcome to the FCC Zoom, Isaac.
Thank you. Thanks, Keith, for having me. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you. I think the last time we saw each other, I think it was, we always used to bump into each other at a restaurant serving New Orleans Creole style food in Beijing near the Jiangmen compound. When were you last in Beijing, and is that restaurant still there?
I don't know if it's still there. I was last in China. I think I was in Beijing to September 2019, and that was probably my last trip for quite some time. You know, never say never, but not planning to go back anytime soon.
All right. Well, if you don't mind, can we just jump right in, because it's a great book. I just finished reading it. It's a short book. It's relatively short, so it's a good read. You can do it relatively quickly. It's called America Second, and the subtitle is How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger. But can you explain the title? Why did you call it America Second?
So when I came back from Beijing, I got frustrated at the way that Americans were talking about China, and it was so different from the way that Chinese people would talk about it, and shared a lot with phrases and terminology that the Communist Party would use. Oh, China has 5,000 years of history. Oh, China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Oh, China doesn't want war, it just wants peace. These sort of received chestnuts of wisdom that were circulating among Americans. And I tried to figure out what was happening and why. And you know, there is, from the last decade, there's a lot of focus on Russia and what Russia's doing. And Russia is more about chaos for chaos's sake, and China's more about changing the way that people think about China. And what they want people to think is both that China's rise is peaceful, and also that China's rise is inevitable. And I wanted this to be a warning to folks to think, well, it's very difficult to know if either of those things are true. I don't think they are. They're both debatable. But if we allow that to be the received wisdom, then America will no longer be the world's most powerful country. Now, fine, maybe there's some positives to that, but that could happen. And here's some things that we should think about as this process is taking place.
Mm-hmm. It's a great book. I want to ask you, I learned a lot out of there. And one of the things you talk about is the kind of this revolving door of the American elite who serve in government. And then immediately when they're out of government, they join some kind of a company doing business with China, or they join the board of a company that does business with China, and they leverage their China expertise. And it was really, you really kind of nailed it. I mean, you start with the grand poobah of American foreign policy, Henry Kissinger. I mean, talk about him a little bit.
such a cone of silence around Kissinger's consulting. And it's amazing, Keith and I both lived in BC. I was there for 5 years, and people don't talk about the business dealings that foreign policy elite do. And, I run a business now. I have clients. I don't generally talk about who they are. It's not that I'm clean and they're not. It's that Kissinger, Scowcroft, Albright, like most of the former secretaries of state, Al Haig, for the old timers among us, he was actually quite craven with all these things as well. But Kissinger left office in 1982. He started a consulting company, Kissinger Associates. And for the last 40 years, we've been listening to Kissinger as some great neutral saint of realism, when actually he's a consultant. And we should take everything he's saying as a consultant first and a foreign policy expert second. And the most egregious example of that was in 1989, a month before the Tiananmen Square massacre. He started something called China Ventures. It was a JV between his association and CITIC, an arm of the Chinese Communist Party, to look for deals in China that would be sanctioned by the party. Tiananmen Square happens. Kissinger goes on TV, does not disclose China Ventures, does not mention Kissinger Associates, and just says, "Oh, I don't think we should do sanctions. I think here's why we should have a more moderate response to Tiananmen." And it was a pretty big scandal a few months later when people realized that, oh, he's financially implicated with this.
And these are things that he doesn't say. People would put him on TV and interview him as a sage on China, the guy who opened relations with China, and he's giving what seems like, impartial, knowledge about China, but in fact, he's making money out of China.
So much money, probably, hard to estimate exactly what, but probably tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars through his company over the last 40 years for door opening in China, for maintaining good relationships with Xi Jinping, for going. I spoke to someone who worked at Kissinger Associates, and he described the way the process would go. You'd sit down with a Politburo member, a Politburo Standing Committee member. You'd have lofty talks about politics and global affairs. And at the very end, you'd say, "Oh, by the way, this US company is having a little problem, and we'd love your help." And that's how it went.
Absolutely amazing. I mean, one of the little tidbits, you had a lot of little tidbits in there. One of the little tidbits is when he was leaving, he'd been Secretary of State, flying around the world. He had an offer to become a tenured professor at Columbia, but he at some point said, what university could give me a plane like this where I can fly around the world? I mean, he just liked the status of flying around the world as a big thinker. He didn't want to be a humble university professor, right?
He did. And then there was a protest when they were thinking about that. Chomsky called him Dr. Death, and all these controversies about Cambodia and Laos. But yeah, I mean, he wanted to remain at the center of things, and he's been stunningly influential and stunningly effective in that.
And you really dug into the Bush family, which I found the most interesting, because we know that George H.W. Bush had served as the first head of the liaison office, or de facto ambassador in China. But you mentioned that he had a brother, Prescott Bush, who was involved in China. And then George W. Bush had a brother, Neil Bush, who was involved in doing business in China. And they kind of leveraged the Bush family's connections to China to make a lot of cash, I assume.
He did. H.W. Bush was quite complicit and did a lot of consulting in Beijing in the 90s, in the 2000s. And it was such a way for the Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao administration to say, listen, Bush Jr., who was president at the time, is so critical of China, but Bush Sr. is a friend of China. Look at all the ways he's being positive towards China and the Chinese people. There must be something wrong with what Bush Jr. is doing. And I'll get to Neil in a second, but I do want to say, W. Bush, for all of his faults, has been an exemplar of an ex-president in terms of not doing the consulting with China, not doing the very lucrative paid speeches. It's funny, Nixon and Bush, two of the most controversial presidents, were the best as it related to China. Reagan got Alzheimer's too soon after leaving office to sort of really count, but Clinton was pretty checkered with this. HW certainly was. W wasn't. But yeah, Neil Bush, son of one president, brother of another president, who has done. Neil Bush is who the Republicans want Hunter Biden to be. He's in deep. He is on many boards of Communist Party linked organizations, and I'm just waiting for more reporting on him. And if someone does want to look into him, there's a lot that we found that didn't make it into the book that I think will be quite important when it comes out.
Yeah, and the to me the most interesting thing about this was, well, aside from the fact that there's no outrage about it, is there's no law against this in the US, that relatives of former high-ranking officials and former high-ranking officials, once they're out of office, they're allowed to leverage their contacts they made when they're in office to make money. So I guess the question is this a US problem, or is it as much as it's a China problem? Is this a problem of the US law?
I really do think it is. And I think strengthening the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, strengthening FARA, Foreign Agent Registrations Act, and making it harder for former officials to lobby. And having lobbying right now is, oh, you have to register as a lobbyist if you spend, I think, more than 20% of your time as a lobbyist. So it's very easy to lobby to not register. And the issue has been, for Madeleine Albright, for Henry Kissinger, for these folks, it's not that they're going and working for Chinese companies, though both of them have done so. It's working for US companies and helping them in China. And there's so many of these consulting shops that are staffed with former officials and don't have the required level of transparency. And there's such a great contrast with China. The Communist Party is so paranoid about its former officials that it takes an opposite approach, which is, if you're a Politburo member, it's almost impossible for you to leave the country, and there's no opportunity for you to go and sit on a US board or sit on a Japanese board. Zhu Rongji, the premier, after leaving, and so many opportunities, so many people wanted him to come speak, wanted him to come join this organization, that organization. Absolutely not possible with the party system. I do feel like there's a lot of European companies, countries, there's Japanese businessmen, former officials who had this revolving door problem, but America's number one in this as well.
Yeah, when I was reading that, I was thinking, for example, a former chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schroeder, sits on the board of a Russian energy company. So this is not uniquely American to hire ex-officials to sit on boards. But I mean, I guess the one question to you is, are the Chinese better at grabbing these guys and women and putting them on these corporate boards and cultivating these relationships?
So they're better. So it's not that common for them, outside of folks like Neil Bush, for Americans to be on Chinese boards. It's that they're so good at flattering ex-officials. They can treat an ex-official like they're a sitting official. When Henry Kissinger is a little different, but when Scowcroft, when Albright goes back to China, when they used to go back before they passed, they were treated as if they were still in office. And, we talk about this idea of Kissinger and the plane and having all the trappings of state. It's very, very effective to go and get to some place where, oh, I'm still respected as I should be. The party is masters at that.
Yeah, you wrote about that a little bit in the book. In fact, you even had a scene where there was a mayor or some local official from Los Angeles who was going there, and basically they got the Kissinger treatment. And Kissinger said, yeah, it'll work because it worked with me. They know how to, they roll out the red carpet for an ex-official and make them feel important again, right?
And it's so effective. It's more effective than money. It's more effective than door opening. It's this gratification. And Kissinger has been, in part because it's part of his persona, part of his sense of humor, but he's so open about his massive ego and what needs to happen to gratify it. And he's certainly not alone.
And you kind of mention in the book, or I would say imply, you didn't say it exactly the way I'm going to say it, which is a bit more blunt, but that people like Kissinger and the Bushes, they did more to assist China than any of these kind of spies or others in the US have done. Is that correct? Or
I would say so. I would say especially Kissinger, because of the way he steered the conversation away from critical aspects of Beijing and just his longevity. I mean, I just kept seeing him pop up, and he was doing so much in plain sight to dampen criticism of Beijing. He called Newt Gingrich after Newt Gingrich, when he was Speaker of the House, wanted to recognize Taiwan, and convince them not to. And then, Newt saying publicly, "Oh, I got a lot to learn from Kissinger. It looks like I made a mistake here," which is such a striking thing for the sitting speaker to tell the New York Times. So yes, I do feel like that's where the blame is laid.
And when I was, studying China and studying this in the US, formally and informally, it was always known as the China consensus. There was a consensus among the elite that we must engage with China, we must do business with China. We cannot isolate or alienate China, because ultimately our engagement will lead to a more open, liberal, democratic China. Yeah. And you're kind of saying that was all a bit of a fallacy, right?
It certainly was. And hindsight's 2020. It's very easy for us to say that now, but this, doing well by doing good. Condi Rice said, economic liberalization leads to political liberalization. It's an iron law. So many people in the 90s and the 2000s, Aaron Friedberg, professor at Princeton, very sharp guy who was in government then, said it was the air that you breathed. This was the milieu. This was the idea. And I think we're only now waking up to the fact that maybe that was always a fallacy. Maybe there was some hope of political liberalization in China, but it ain't happening. And we're in this sort of interregnum of ideas from about 2018 to the present, where we don't really know what our China policy is. Are we trying to contain China? Are we trying to weaken China? Are we trying to strengthen China? Are we trying to coexist? There's not yet an intellectual framework, and the Biden administration hasn't come up with one yet. And we're very curious to see, what are they going to do? What is going to be the underpinnings of these ideas?
Well, what's your feeling? I mean, having researched this for the book, I mean, when these elites, the Kissingers and then Hank Paulson and others, are talking about we have to stay engaged with China, were they doing that because they really believe that if we did this, China would open up? Or were they doing that because they were working for companies making money out of China?
It's so hard to know. It's so hard to untangle. And I think about this question a lot, and it's sort of, what part of what you and I are talking about right now comes from the various networks that we're in, the various conflicts of interest we have, and what part is just our, pure ideology and our thinking on this. And it's, you can go by what people say, but Kissinger is infamous for being deceitful. And, when studying him, there's so many people who were in very powerful positions with him who would just, people who liked him, people who didn't, who would just talk about his tendency to prevaricate in very open terms. So it's very difficult to know. I think I guess I kind of go back and forth between how aware they are of these things and how much they did truly believe it. And frankly, I don't know what's worse. It's really difficult to say.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. One of the, I think you quoted in the book, if I'm not mistaken, you quoted old friend Jim Mann, LA Times. Now, he wrote a really interesting book called The China Fallacy. I think they came out even before the Olympics in 2008, where he kind of said, look, this is all a fantasy. The fantasy is if we keep engaging China, that somehow they're going to open up and democratize and become more like us. And it's not true. They will take our money, and they'll take McDonald's and they'll take KFC, but they're not going to become more like us, and they're not going to open up. When that book came out, it got a little bit of criticism, from the China consensus and the China community. I mean, talk a little bit about that. I'm sure you read it.
It was a fantastic book. He was remarkably prescient, and he was right. And it was much braver saying those things 15 years ago, when he was, if not alone, then much more isolated with those ideas than they are today. And they've certainly taken root today. And I think that, there's been so many fantastic books that have pushed against the narrative on this. I thought that was exemplary. I thought John Proffitt's book on the US-China relationship was also a really fantastic summation, and a book that I quoted several times throughout. And I think it's hard to know too, what we're saying right now, what's going to look prescient 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when China has invaded Taiwan, or China hasn't invaded Taiwan, and the party has liberalized, the party hasn't liberalized. And, Xi Jinping is party chairman, or Xi Jinping is deposed. It's really difficult to know how these things are going to evolve.
Well, I thought your book was almost like a follow-on to the Jim Mann's The China Fantasy. When I was reading it, I was thinking, wow, this is like an update to that book. But let me ask you, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, proud to be in that tradition.
You're kind of contrarian. You didn't buy into the China consensus as everybody has, which is kind of great. But you spent a few chapters in there, which I thought were really interesting, looking at Hollywood. Talk about how Brad Pitt almost stopped Mickey Mouse from being in China.
1997 was the honest bliss for Hollywood's relationship with China. 3 films came out that year that had elements that Beijing decided to find critical. 7 Years in Tibet, Kundun, and Red Corner. And I had to watch all of those films again. Kundun's pretty good. The other 2 were very, very schmaltzy. But Beijing had just gotten over a scandal called Chinagate, mostly forgotten today, where head of military intelligence gives a couple $100,000 in cash to a Democratic fundraiser and says, this is to elect your President Clinton. That's illegal under US law. This was sort of the scandal of the Clinton administration until the Monica Lewinsky scandal made everyone forget about this. And Beijing was realizing, well, the way to exert influence in the United States is not by directly giving money. You have to be more subtle. You have to be more sophisticated than that. And they realized that after these films came out, by banning US studios and by putting a lot of pressure on Disney, they were able to have these studios act in ways that were more beneficial to Beijing's interest. And it was not an overnight process. It took a very long time. There's a lot of back and forth between Hollywood and Beijing. But what happened over this period, and especially since about 2013, 2014, is Hollywood studios just entirely removed anything that they were worried would be controversial towards Beijing. And so now we're in this very bizarre world where Hollywood films are more pro-Beijing than Chinese films. And I saw this very strikingly with Wolf Warrior 2. Have you seen that?
I've seen the trailers of it. I have not yet sat down to watch the entire thing. Yeah.
It's a pretty appalling film, but it's this jingoistic, more Rambo than Rambo Chinese movie. And in the beginning, the hero saves a Chinese martyr's tomb from rapacious Chinese real estate developers. And I was watching that film and I was thinking, oh, rapacious Chinese real estate developers can't have that in a US film. And so here's this paradigm of Chinese patriotism that has Chinese bad guys. And I just find the portrayal of Chinese people in Hollywood so one-dimensional. And I find it very offensive. I mean, that if you just portray the positives of a race, it's, I think about that. I'm Jewish. I think about that with Jewish portrayals. If every Jew in a film was a doctor or a lawyer and everyone was saying, oh, I got to call this Jewish lawyer to really help me out, maybe a really big problem. But yeah, so I'm quite disappointed at how Hollywood portrays China, and I'd like to see some realism in their films.
And that's because Hollywood, which is it? Is it because that Hollywood knows that they got to get their films on the Chinese screens to make money, or is it that with these co-productions, et cetera, China is where the money is, and they can help finance film? I mean, we know Hollywood runs on other people's money, right?
Yeah, it's funny. It's kind of a third option. It's that because they're part of large studios, they're worried that if they do anything that Beijing finds offensive, other parts of their business will be impacted negatively. So when Disney is thinking about, oh, do I have any character in this that could be offensive to the Chinese Communist Party, they don't worry that that particular film will be blocked. They worry that their theme park will be closed down, or that there'll be some sort of tax regulation that Beijing has decided that they violated, or their cruise line won't be able to expand there. A factory where they're exporting goods will suddenly have a problem. It's that asymmetrical warfare that Beijing does. And so it's the reason why a film that has no dream of even entering the Chinese box office still has to self-censor. And one of the points I make in the book is you don't actually have to do that. There are ways around this, but Hollywood is so petrified.
Oh, interesting. And you mentioned how scripts are actually changed to satisfy, not even to satisfy the Chinese market, but to satisfy what people think the Chinese might do if they don't like it. And you mentioned, for example, a James Bond film, which I like, Tomorrow Never Dies. I mean, that was actually changed, right?
Yeah, that was the first film that I was able to find that was changed to deal with Chinese Communist Party sentiments, and that was Kissinger. The studio had worked with Kissinger, and Kissinger recommended them changing the plot because the original plot he thought would be too offensive to Beijing. And I think you made a good distinction there. It's not about what Chinese people want. It's not about what Chinese people can take, what they're offended by or not. It's what various officials in the party might decide to be offended by.
Mm-hmm. And again, even still, though, China still limits the number of American films and foreign films that can come into their screen. So it's not a guarantee that if you make the villain not Chinese, that you're going to get your film in the Chinese box office, right?
And then that makes the system so much stronger. If you knew what the rules were, and you always knew, then you could follow the rules. But the rules constantly change. Sometimes the rules are not followed. Sometimes a film is blocked for reasons that never come to light. And it could have absolutely nothing to do with the content of the film.
Sure. And can I just ask, oh, by the way, if anybody has any questions, please do send those now, because we have some time, to question at fcchk.org. So if you got any questions for our guest here, Isaac, question at fcchk.org. And I will read your question out. But let me just continue on Hollywood for a minute, just to play devil's advocate for a minute. What if people say, yeah, but that's no different than Hollywood has to now, they don't want to depict Middle Easterners in a negative light, or they don't like to depict Africans in a negative light. So they're just catering to more sensibility. Hollywood's more sensitive than it used to be to international concern. So just not depicting China in a negative light is the same as what we would do in the Middle East or what we do with Africa. I mean, is it different with China?
It's different with China in that Hollywood films still regularly depict the Middle East or Africa or Black people in America or Arabs or Middle Easterns in a negative light. And sometimes I think you can argue in certain cases they depict them more realistically. I mean, Africans, just like people all over the world, have complicated realities. And the problem with China is less that they're saying, oh gosh, Hollywood has a terrible history of anti-Asian racism and Asian portrayals in films like Breakfast at Tiffany's, where we're cruel and cartoonish. And so we need to rectify that. I have no problem with that. I think that's quite important. I think the issue is less, oh, Hollywood needs to improve its history of racism, and more, this is a different type of racism it's sort of like philo-Semitism. It's, when you're just portraying people positively. And I don't think we've fixed it with Middle Easterners or Africans. And at the same time, it's sad to say that, like a film like Beasts of No Nation, which I guess, wasn't a studio film, it was, I think, Netflix, but, you can argue against the portrayal of some of the characters in that film, but you could never make a film like that about China, which portrayed something negative from an African nation. I think the other issue is there's another Bond film. I can't remember right now what it was called. A little bit more coffee for that. It came out around 2012, 2013, and the film opens in Istanbul, and it's dusty, it's crowded, it's poor, and then it goes to this futuristic Shanghai, and which has absolutely no negative. It's sort of more modern than New York. And at the time that the film came out, Shanghai's per capita income was lower than Istanbul's. But Istanbul, poor, dusty, Muslim, China, futuristic, nondescript. And that continues to happen today.
Wow. So it's all about just trying to not offend, or not even doing something you think might offend Chinese government sensibility. And I'm not even saying Chinese audiences, because they probably want to see a lot of different things, but it's just the government sensibilities here, right?
Yeah. And I think that the general trend we're seeing, part of the reason why superhero movies are so dominant is, they are the beasts of no nation. You can have bad guys that don't have to say, oh no, is this person Russian? Or, oh gosh, well, if they're North Korean, maybe we'll get hacked again. Or, oh, if they're from this country, maybe we'll get a letter writing campaign and people will try to cancel us from this country. And so a superhero from a different planet, that planet has no as the constituency.
So the evil people should be from other planets, not from China or not from North Korea. North Korea is okay still, right?
Well, no, I mean, no, after the Sony hack, North Korea, I don't think has been
Good
a
point.
negative, a butt of a joke. So yeah, it's those superheroes that, and those super villains, so much safer for Hollywood in Hollywood's mind.
Well, let me ask you, and again, if anybody has any questions, please do send those questions singular at fcchk.org, question singular at fcchk.org. I want to talk to you about universities, something dear to my heart, because in addition to Hollywood, you say universities have now started to, for lack of a better word, pander to China because they're so reliant on Chinese money for donations and Chinese students, correct?
So universities, I think, have to be held to a different standard. If you compare them to Hollywood, they're so much more forthright and honest and open and intellectually creative than Hollywood. But because they're supposed to be paradigms of free speech and debate, I think it is important to be critical to them and important to be critical to those who self-censor and make sacrifices in order to preserve their visa access. And I think it's important to, I spent a lot of time in the book talking about times when I've censored myself and when I've made moral compromises in order to maintain my access. I think the problem I have is when people don't know that they're doing it or don't admit publicly that they're doing it. I think the situation in universities is a lot of universities don't want to lose Chinese students, Chinese money. I think it's fantastic that there are so many Chinese students in America. I think there should be more. I think the pandemic is a very large culprit of that, especially Beijing's handling of the pandemic. But universities need to be honest and open about the compromises that they're making so that people can debate whether or not they should make those compromises. NYU Shanghai, there was I think a vice dean or associate dean who said, listen, we're going to set up a campus in Shanghai and it's going to have the same level of academic freedom that it does in the States. That is a lie. That is absolutely false. What he should have said is, we're going to set up a campus in Shanghai. We believe that the benefits of having this campus, both to the university and to give American students a chance to go and live in China and learn Chinese and mix with Chinese students, outweighs the censorship and the moral compromises that we have to make to set up a university. You can't pretend that going to China allows for the same level of academic freedom. It's not true. And that I find very problematic. I find that very misleading. And I think it's, students should be able to make their own decision. It's sort of like telling a student who's gay, go to Saudi Arabia, be yourself. That's unfortunately not great advice. It's okay, here's the laws and rules and regulations in Saudi Arabia. We don't approve of them. We find these to be quite cruel. But that's the way things are here. And so, you should make an informed decision about whether or not the benefits of being there and learning Arabic and learning about the country outweighs the costs to you.
And what would be some of those hypothetical, moral compromises that NYU Shanghai would have had to make? Okay.
Appointing party officials into important positions at the university, allowing party officials to censor certain classes, having teachers who will self-censor when they're talking about certain areas, not allowing for free debate, not allowing for university publications to publish controversial things about, or not even controversial, but things that are unfortunate. Well, I guess they have to say controversial in a Chinese context of the genocide in Xinjiang or the situation in Tibet and Taiwan. And I think it's very often people will say, oh, I was very open. I mentioned Taiwan. I mentioned Tibet. The party mentions those places all the time. It's not that no one talks about Taiwan or Tibet. It's about what you say about them, what are the orthodoxies around them, and what other viewpoints can you put forward. So if NYU Shanghai wants to prove me wrong and put out a journal that publishes a lot of information that would not be controversial in a US context, but is very controversial in a Chinese context, happy to eat my words there. But you hear, off the record quietly, so many examples, so many counterexamples to that in all of these universities.
Yeah, and again, I mean, you could arguably, I wouldn't argue it, but one could arguably say that if you're in China, you got to do what the Chinese do and what they want. But you say even in the U.S., professors censor what they say or won't address certain topics. You talk about the 3 T's, right? Yeah. Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen. There's 3 areas where people generally don't talk about it. not just in China, not at universities based in China, but even in the US, where we have free speech.
Yeah. I mean, I think the one thing I've learned, neither side is absolute. It's not China is censored and the US is free. We're both on this continuum. There are areas where free speech is restricted in the United States. There are areas where it's open in China. I think the scorn that I heap most directly is to folks who are making these compromises and pretending they're not, and constraining the debate because of it. I think there's a lot to be said about selective self-censorship. The question, there was a University of Minnesota Chinese student who went back to China and then got arrested for tweets critical of Xi Jinping. And I was just thinking, if I were a professor at University of Minnesota and I were teaching the student, he said, listen, what do you think about Xi Jinping? I have all these views. I want to express them. What should I say? It's a very difficult thing to advise him on. Because I'd like to say, great, express yourself. I agree. I think this is really important, but you're also giving him, the path to get himself in trouble, and in a way that doesn't harm you. I think they used to describe reporters in China as having a ring of fire around them, foreign reporters. You would be safe, but you could burn other people. It's not true for foreign reporters in China now because of the way the climate has shifted. But I think professors in the United States, it's really worth having these public debates about what is appropriate things to talk about. If you have 5 Chinese students in class and you want to encourage some of them to speak, they don't know who's going to report them back to authorities in Beijing, who's going to get them in trouble, who's going to give them a hard time for their views on Xinjiang or Tibet. And so you have other students in the class. Do you encourage these controversial debates and get those students in trouble, or do you self-censor so that debate doesn't happen? And I do feel like there's an argument on both sides. It's just, don't pretend you're not self-censoring.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book about how some Chinese students in the US said basically that they were always worried that somebody had an eye on them, and when people knew who they were, and sometimes were even their job was to follow certain students around. Is that right?
Yeah. And, we're so much more protected, and especially me here in the States, the implications for me are not nearly as serious as for these Chinese students who have family in China, who might want to go back, who have very strong friend networks, and there's a lot of pressure points for them. And so I do really worry about that. And as we're talking about censorship, I also worry about it from the other side. I don't want folks who are very supportive of the Chinese Communist Party or very supportive of what China is and what it's doing to have their voices censored as well. I do feel like I don't think we're there, but I am a little worried that the pendulum has swung too much in the other direction. And now folks who are pro-Beijing are being censored and having their voices silent. I have a lot more problems with people like Kissinger who are speaking about it for reasons that I find to be much more compromised, as opposed to folks who just believe these things and deserve to have a platform and deserve to have a debate about it.
Yeah, can I ask you, because you were there, I know, as a journalist in China. I mean, as was I, were there at the same time, and were there ever instances where you basically self-censored, where you said, "Oh, I know this, but I shouldn't write this because that'll get me kicked out"?
Oh my gosh, all the time. And I think it probably would not have gotten me kicked out. I think it was just that fear. You were talking before about Hong Kong. I was in Hong Kong for 2 months on visa exile. I didn't want to do that again. I didn't want to have restrictions on my visa. And even when I was back in the States, there's I think it's the University of International Relations in Beijing, which is seen as sort of a spy school. It's a place that officially trains people who want to go in diplomatic service, but a lot of it, the idea is, this is also kind of an MSS feeder school. And I wanted to do a story about that, but I was very worried about my visa with that. There was another one that I always wished I had done. The All China Women's Federation on Xinjiang. Someone had told me, and I never went, I don't know if this is true or not, but someone told me that there's a brothel at the bottom of the All China Women's Federation for high-ranking cadres. And I just thought the irony of that was so so delicious. But I never followed up on it because I was afraid, oh, it's too sensitive. It's this building on Chanjia. It's too close to the seats of power. And so, I shouldn't do a story on this. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to look back, and there's plenty of other examples, and it's hard to look back on these things and see them as anything but moral cowardice.
Yeah, and again, I don't blame you. We all did it. I remember not long ago, a journalist was kicked out of China or something, and other foreign journalists in China, most of whom had left, kind of got on their high horse and said, "I've never censored myself when I was in China." And I remember reading that, going, "Oh, that's complete BS. We all did." It's just the way you word things and the way you phrase things. I mean, it's complete BS to say you've never self-censored if you're in China, because if you hadn't, you wouldn't be there. But I noticed that you didn't self-censor in the book. You kind of didn't pull any stops here. What's going on? You're going to go back?
I mean, I would say that I didn't. So my career now is incentivized to be critical to Beijing. It was an easy thing for me to do. Most of my friends have left. I don't have family there. I don't plan to go back, even though I do miss the place. I feel like Beijing is in my blood. And I did think a lot about who did I criticize and who did I not criticize in the book. And I don't want to say that I didn't self-censor in the book. There was certainly more that I could have said. And, I think back a lot on how much personal relationships changes the way that we're willing to talk about people. Never met Kissinger. We reached out to him for the book. He declined to comment. I wonder if I had, and if he had spent a lot of time grooming me, would I have been so critical to him because I had a personal relationship with him? There's one person who I'll just say who it is. It feels silly to not, but I remember I interviewed Hank Paulson about 5 or 6 years ago for Foreign Policy. And, he was so kind to me. He was so charming. He was so gracious with his time. And I don't really criticize him in the book. And I think, oh, well, he did it the reverse. He made a lot of money and then he went into government. But I always wondered to myself, if I had never met him or if he had treated me more poorly, would I then have criticized him in the book? And it's such a sort of, you sort of look at yourself and you look at the decisions you make and you think, wow, that's really petty if that's the reason why, you did or didn't criticize someone. But I do wonder that, with who I went after and who I didn't. And I think part of the problem with, journalism or really any other field is it is so incestuous. There's these people that people that you like, people that you don't like. You do understand, well, I want to be doing this for a long time. If I burn a source or if I burn someone who has been nice to me, maybe I'll get a reputation as a difficult person. It'll be harder for me to do stories in the future. And so there's all these moral calculuses that you make.
You decided that Kissinger is not somebody you need in the future, right?
I think I felt so at my former magazine, someone told me that the former CEO of Foreign Policy used to work at Kissinger Associates. And and someone told me that he asked to see all mentions of Kissinger in Foreign Policy, which is so deeply inappropriate. But I was so stunned at the silence facing Kissinger. He's so effective at co-opting his ideological enemies. There was someone I talked to this person I won't name because they told me this off the record, but I talked to a very prominent US columnist who had written a column critical of Kissinger. And so I talked to him about it. He told me about the column and I said, well, great. This is very useful. Do you want to go on the record? And he said, no, I'm just getting invited back to these dinners.
Did you actually talk to Kissinger for the book at all? No.
No. So we reached out many times. We got a response instead from representatives of Kissinger who, tried to warn us away from, I don't keep saying we tried to warn me away from doing the writing of the book. And, we decided to keep going anyway. But no, he didn't want to talk.
I'll tell you, my one conversation with Henry Kissinger was when I was in Hong Kong in the late 1990s. And I wrote a story about Vietnam, of all things, a little historical piece on the Vietnam War. And I got a call from they said it was Kissinger's office. He wanted to talk to me. And he said, I got one little thing wrong. I'd mentioned a secret letter between the Vietnamese. And he said, there was never a secret letter. I was thinking to myself, why are you bothering calling me in Hong Kong to correct one sentence in a story that appeared on page A52 of the Washington Post?
He's so particular about his legacy. I talked to someone who used to be at the New York Times. He used to call the New York Times to offer to edit his own obituary.
Well, that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna edit my own obituary. That's good. Let me before we have a few more minutes left, please, if you have any questions, do please send them in the question at fcchk.org. I got one or two here, but before I go there, I mean, I'd love to let's bring it to the current time now, because since everything you write about, Donald Trump came in, he kind of upended this China consensus. He didn't listen to these guys who were saying that we have to kowtow to China. But on the other hand, he went there and they flattered him with this Forbidden City dinner, et cetera. But he came out and he was talking pretty tough about China. So what have things changed kind of since what you were writing about with people kowtowing to China?
So what was so surprising to me about Trump is that in so many ways he was different, but he also did continue some of these patterns. I think it was Bob Davis at Ling Ling Wei at the Journal who had this great scoop about how Kissinger was the one who reportedly convinced Trump not to meet with the Dalai Lama. So Trump was the first president since Reagan to not do so. Wilbur Ross, Commerce Secretary, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin were still, very much in these old patterns, these old way of thinking, especially Mnuchin. And it really didn't feel like it started shifting until 2018, 2019. Certainly a lot of people in the more working levels, deputy assistant secretaries, folks like that, were a lot more critical. And, other cabinet members were as well. McMaster was as well. I think we're still trying to figure out what the new normal is. And the Biden administration has kept up a lot of what the Trump administration did. I think if Clinton had won, I think she would have started moving in a very different direction. I think this consensus, that has governed policy for so long is dying. And I mean, I think we have to remember Obama talked about strengthening China. We want a strong, stable, I think you would say strong, stable, and prosperous China. And people were so clear for so long about not wanting to contain China, wanting to support China's growth. And yeah, as of the last several years, and especially since COVID, it's really changed. And I think a big piece of that too, a lot of people will say, well, the US needs to engage with China. The US needs to engage with China. Well, it's very difficult to do so if you have to quarantine for 21 days or 28 days, and Chinese people can't really come here. So I think the biggest reason by far that there's so much less engagement between the US and China is Beijing's paranoia around COVID. And when that stops and people can circulate again, it'll be easier to do so. And I don't know if that'll be quote unquote better or worse for the relationship, but it will make it a lot easier for people to see family and friends.
Yeah, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I may be. I'm here, you're in the US, but I detected from the 2016 election going forward, on the right, you had a lot of opposition to China because of various reasons of seen as a military competitor, economic competitor. On the left, because of labor unions, you saw them as people, the trade issue. So you had the Bernie Sanders side of the Democratic Party and the Donald Trump Republican Party always almost coalescing in a kind of less Kissingerian view of China and more of just seeing China as a competitor, someone we have to fight against. Is that correct? That the China consensus is broken down?
It is. There's such strange ideological bedfellows on the critical to Beijing area. And I think the folks that aren't, some are the very pro-business Republicans and, what you could call the Kissingerian Republicans. And then on the left, you have progressives, some stripes of progressives who feel like partnering with China to fight climate change is so much more important than any other issues. Some feel, oh, well, the US is an imperial power and whatever the China has done pales in comparison to the US, and, can't understand that non-white people can also be imperialists, sort of forget about, Japan circa World War II and forget about arguably China today. And then also the folks who are very concerned about anti-Asian racism. I'm also very concerned about that. And I feel that what we need to understand in the United States is that that really silences voices who would otherwise be critical of Beijing. And the Asian community in the States is A, very diverse, and B, contains a lot of people who are very, very anti-CCP. Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, others. And I think there's a sense among some on the left that the general view of Asians in the United States is that they support what China is doing, and that is so false. And so I think there needs to be sort of more airing of these conversations, more debates about them rather than less.
Do you think in the kind of not just the political side, but just in U.S. society, is China seen as a friend of the U.S., a rival to the U.S., a competitor? I mean, how would you phrase it?
Definitely, and it has been such a striking change over the last several years, but definitely much more competitor, rival. And I think with the war in Ukraine, there's now a lot of people realizing, oh gosh, there are other costs to doing so much business with an authoritarian nation. And what will happen if China invades Taiwan, or if China actively supports Russia or actively joins the war on Russia's side, which seems quite unlikely, but is not outside the realm of possibility. So I think that's having an impact on the business community, which has traditionally been a lot more Beijing than other aspects. But yeah, I mean, the view in the States is far more critical of Beijing. I mean, you saw the way that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act passed in the Senate House, unanimous in the Senate, one holdout in the House. And it's, there is this climate of, if not agreement, then at least for now, consensus that more has to be done against pushing back on Beijing. And like the consensuses that predated this one, it's also faulty. There needs to be more nuance, there needs to be more debate, but things have shifted very, very rapidly here.
Yeah, it's interesting. And how much of that, if any, is because China itself has changed? I mean, China used to kind of keep its head down diplomatically. Now you've got these kind of what they call wolf warrior diplomats that are out there attacking, going after anybody who says anything critical about Hong Kong or critical about China. I mean, is that causing a bit of a backlash?
I think it definitely is. I think it's that. I think it's the strong authoritarian turn that China has taken under Xi Jinping and the stifling of domestic debate. I think it's the genocide in Xinjiang, where upwards of 1 million Muslims and others have been held in concentration camps. I think it's also a general realization that, this consensus we had before about China liberalizing has now proven to be wrong. And B, China is now large enough, wealthy enough, powerful enough to really jeopardize U.S. interests globally. And I think folks on both sides of the aisle are starting to realize that and starting to wake up to the fact that we need a national debate about what to do about this.
But also, I remember, because I was going into China, well, since the late 80s, but really covering it from here since the 90s. And, the old cliche was, 1 billion people. So, if they got 2 billion armpits, if you sell deodorant, you can sell 1 billion, sticks of deodorant, you could sell 1 billion how much of this was because the business community finally realized that, well, wait, hold on a second. It's not this kind of, manna from heaven that we thought it was going to be in terms of business. I mean, is that, have they had excuse the expression, a come to Jesus moment when it comes to China?
I'm hoping so. I'm trying to encourage that, but I think people still have this Orientalist fantasy about, oh yes, if we can just conquer the Chinese market and everyone can feel the way that we do, and 2 billion eyes, or there's an insurance executive who said, when we think about something like 1 billion policies, our mouths start to water. I think it's slowly shifting, but not shifting nearly enough. I think there's still this sense that whatever sacrifices we need to make are worth it.
Okay, and let me get at least one question in here. I got one from our friend and FCC member Alejandro Reyes, who's with the Asia Global Institute at Hong Kong University. I did not pick the question because he's at Hong Kong University. He said, it's a comment and a question. He said, Alejandro says, I would argue that the idea of China becoming more liberal or democratic because of engagement with the West is somewhat of an ex post facto idea, and that I'm not sure what is truly paramount in those days when the US and other major trading economies were negotiating the WTO accession. And even if this was a real expectation, it was more projection of the West and not really a hope harbored by other actors, particularly those in Asia or those who have been democracies. But he's saying, regardless of the egregious behavior of the Kissingers and the Bushes, et cetera, in terms of making commercial hay out of promoting engagement, the engagement imperative is certainly a valid argument that many of China's neighbors support for economic, trade, environmental, and even security reasons. What is critical is the nature of this engagement. So that's not about the engagement. It's what's critical is the nature of the engagement. And Alejandro writes, in your work, you have focused on the Xinjiang genocide issue, for example. Should this be an absolute deal breaker for countries and businesses dealing and engaging with China in the same way, for example, that the West is seeking to isolate Russia for reaction to what's going on in Ukraine with the invasion? So to simplify that, Alejandro's comment and question, I mean, are there any things that you should say, these are deal breakers, you shouldn't be dealing with China because of X, Y, or Z? Or is engagement still in the best interest of everybody?
I think that's a great question. I think it really depends on the particular individual actor. And I encourage everyone who still goes to China or still does business with China to have a very clear sense of what your red line is. Is it, if any of my employees get detained or harassed by MSS, I'm not going to do it. Or if we discover that we have a Xinjiang factory in our supply chain, we're going to pull out. When for countries, it's much more difficult because the sticks are so much more punishing. Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, Thailand can't move away from China. Vietnam is going to be a neighbor regardless of what happens. And so they have to make much more difficult calculuses on, how much can Beijing threaten them and their interests? How much do their economies need to depend on China to grow? I think it's an easier question and easier for individuals and companies to pull out than it is for countries to do so.
And let me ask you, you spent 7 years living in China. You spent a long time learning the language. You're fluent in Mandarin, but you wrote a book that you didn't censor yourself. I mean, you could have been a bit more nuanced and gotten your book published in China, but you decided to just go all out. I mean, what were you thinking? What was your calculus on this now? I mean, a guy who spent 7 years in China, you speak the language, you care about the country, but you may be stopping yourself from being able to go back in again.
There was some point in, 2015, 2016, where I realized that I had developed this voice in my head that said, should I do this? Should I write this? Maybe this will jeopardize my access, maybe this, maybe that. And I think I just got tired of it. It just felt, I think I had reached my line, and I don't remember what the last straw was, but maybe what, and I mentioned this in the book, but I used to do work with the World Economic Forum, and I was sitting there taking notes and listening to this prominent Chinese scientist talk about the war in Iraq and why he'd returned to China, because China was the ethical answer, the ethical option here, and then the U.S. was so wrong. And I remember sitting there and keeping my mouth shut and not bringing up Xinjiang, and it just felt so egregious to me. I guess if I had to point to one thing, it would be Xinjiang. I mean, I was raised, as many Jews are, on a steady diet of never again. And then here we are with this country that I love. And it just felt that the internal cost of being quiet on these things grew too high.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Listen, before I let you go, I always ask all of our guests here at the FCC, just for the benefit of our guests in the audience here and on YouTube, what are you reading these days? What can you recommend?
So there's a mid-century author named Harvey Swados, sort of a classical liberal, writes a lot about upstate New York. I've gotten a little bit into his books. I had a brief Patricia Highsmith phase, but she is grim. So I'm also rereading a bunch of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett novels. It feels like they're fun, escapist, 1920s, 1930s, San Francisco, very hard-boiled. So Maltese Falcon, I would argue, is the best, and then Big Sleep, but really enjoyable books.
Big Sleep, Maltese Falcon, Raymond Chandler, right? Good cop novels, good detective novels.
Yes.
And your book, America's Second, How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger. Can we get it in Hong Kong?
Probably not. I think some delivery services will send it there. I don't think it's going to be in Hong Kong bookstores. I think that's probably best for Hong Kong's quite fragile laws right now. But I think it is available for order online, and always happy to send PDFs to folks.
Well, we love our real hard copy books here. And will it be? I guess it will not be in Chinese, right? It's not going to be translated into Chinese.
It'll be translated it'll be a Taiwanese edition, so it'll be in traditional characters, and then that'll be available for folks to import from Taiwan if they so choose. But yeah, I think the way Hong Kong is going, not very optimistic about it appearing in Hong Kong bookstores.
Okay, but they can get it on Amazon. They're from Amazon.
Definitely get it on Amazon. Yeah, so you can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it at Barnes & Noble, Target, a lot of other independent bookstores, and they should all be able to ship it out, hopefully.
Okay, the book is America's Second: How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger by Isaac Stone Fish. If you're coming back to Hong Kong, you're going to be in quarantine. You need something to read. It's a good quarantine book. Thank you so much. You're in New York now. How's New York doing? It's good.
New York's fantastic. Yeah, so we're just on the precipice of spring, and things do seem to be nice and opening up. So it's good to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. Maybe one day you can come to Hong Kong and visit us once we get rid of this ridiculous quarantine and all the flight suspensions and all that nonsense. We look forward to seeing you here at the FCC.
Thank you, Keith. It was great to chat. Really appreciate the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Isaac Stonefish, and then thank you everybody for joining us in the Zoom room or on YouTube later on. Thank you, and good evening.
Thank you. Good evening.